The sun was still low when Samuel Holloway stopped sharpening the blade of his scythe and lifted his eyes to the cornfield, where the dawn mist clung stubbornly to the cracked earth. He was alone, as he had been ever since he buried his wife beneath the old oak tree shading the yard. The wind drifted through the rows, carrying the dry scent of husks and the taste of dust that clung to the back of his throat. He heard it before he saw it, a faint rustle almost lost in the whisper of the leaves, then the shallow, ragged breathing of something too small to fight back. Samuel set the scythe down at the edge of the furrow and stepped forward, boots creaking in the damp soil. That's when he saw him, a frail figure crouched low, skin muddy and scraped, a shirt hanging in tatters from bony shoulders. Two dark eyes, wide as the sky and twice as empty, trembled more than the boy's cracked hands. Samuel stopped a few steps away. His voice, when it came, was rougher than he remembered. "Hey there, son, you hurt?" The boy didn't answer. He trembled where he crouched. His bare feet were cut from the sharp stones hidden in the dirt, leaving little prints of blood in the clay. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, if that. And here he was, crouched in a stranger's field like a rabbit cornered by wolves. Samuel slowly crouched down, resting a knee in the mud. The boy flinched back half a step, but had nowhere left to run. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you here," Samuel murmured. He knew promises didn't mean much in a place where men broke them like dry twigs. So he gave the boy what he had, empty, calloused hands, palms open, and a stale crust of bread he pulled from the pocket of his work apron. It took time for the boy to trust him. When he did, he snatched the bread so fast, Samuel had to ease it back or risk tearing the boy's cracked lips. Samuel watched him devour the crust, every bite so desperate it made the old man's chest tighten. Kneeling there in the dirt, Samuel felt something stir in him he'd thought dead and buried, responsibility and fear. Fear of what the town would say, fear of what they'd do when they found out Samuel Holloway, Old Holloway of Stone Ranch, they called him, was sheltering a runaway slave boy. Out here in this dusty corner of the world, the law didn't weigh near as much as the laughter behind your back. Samuel wiped the boy's mouth with a faded handkerchief, then lifted him gently in his arms. The boy weighed less than a sack of feed, skin, bones, and a flicker of hope. "Got a name?" Samuel asked, walking him toward the old barn. The boy just stared at him, eyes so wide they looked like they held more stories than any grown man could bear. Inside the barn, Samuel laid him on a bed of dry straw in the far corner, away from the draft. He fetched an old horse blanket from the tack room and tucked it around the boy's shoulders. Outside, dawn gave way to pale daylight, and with it, the world of wagging tongues, half-truths, and spit on a man's boots. At Thompson's general store, the gossip started faster than a prairie fire. Martha Bell, the town midwife who knew everyone's secrets, was the first to hiss it out. "You seen Holloway? Carrying some colored boy like he was his own kin." Laughter cracked across the porch. Nobody dared say it to Samuel's face. Not since the day he'd nearly killed a crooked horse trader with a branding iron. But talking behind his back cost nothing. By sundown, the whole village buzzed. They called him a fool, said he was harboring thieves, said he'd lose his land protecting someone he shouldn't. Back at the ranch, Samuel pretended not to hear. He fixed the broken fence post, watered the hogs, swept the dirt yard. All the while his eyes kept drifting to the barn. Sometimes he'd crack the door open, find the boy sleeping, chest rattling like dry leaves in the wind. And every time he saw the angry welts carved into that small back, deep purple scars from a whip, something inside Samuel twisted with quiet rage. The second night, the rain came hard. It beat down on the tin roof like a warning shot. Samuel sat beside the boy, an old Winchester resting across his knees. Outside, the dogs barked at shadows. He thought of the day he buried his wife under the oak, the rain soaking him to the bone, promising never to let another soul depend on him again. And here he was, breaking the last promise that had kept him numb all these years. Near dawn, the boy stirred, tried to sit up but whimpered at the pain. Samuel pressed a rough hand to his bony chest. "Stay put. You're safe here." The boy's eyes fluttered open, big, bottomless, and he whispered something Samuel barely caught. Caleb, a name. Small as a spark, but bright enough to light a candle in that cold, lonely barn. In the days that followed, Caleb learned to stand again, though he limped like a bird with a broken wing. Samuel gave him what little he had, a mess of eggs, stale bread soaked in coffee, scraps of salted pork. Each bite drew out a flicker of a smile, shy, hesitant, the kind that hurt to see because it reminded Samuel how young he really was. Outside, the whispers turned to pointed stares. 3 neighbors rode up to the gate one afternoon, wide hats pulled low. They clapped their hands like they were calling in strays. Samuel came out slow, rifle slung loose over his shoulder. "What's your business?" The oldest, Howard Clegg, spat tobacco into the dirt before he spoke. "We come to tell you, Holloway, what you're doing ain't right. That boy, he's gonna bring ruin on this place." Samuel stayed silent. The rifle was heavy, but not near as heavy as the look in his eyes. He thought about burying it in the ground and being done with the fight. But instead, he bit down on the unlit stub of his cigar and drawled, "Ruin's been here long before that boy, Clegg. You just never bothered to see it." They left, muttering under their breath, but Samuel knew the seeds were sown. Trouble would come, one way or another. That night he sat by the barn door watching the stars fade into clouds. Caleb lay curled on the old cot, a scrap of blanket clutched tight. Outside, the wind howled like an empty church. And in the hush between heartbeats, Samuel felt it. Not fear, not regret, but a stubborn ember of something he thought long gone. Hope. The morning after the neighbors came to the gate, Samuel found Caleb standing barefoot by the old chicken coop, staring at the hens like he'd never seen a creature so free. The boy's shoulders were still raw with half-healed scabs, but he stood straighter now, like the bones inside him remembered what it meant to belong to himself. Samuel watched him from the porch, arms folded tight across his chest. For a moment he saw a ghost of the son he'd once hoped for, before the fever took his wife and every chance of children with her. The thought made his jaw clench. He spat into the dirt, as if to rid his mouth of memories that tasted too sweet to keep. Caleb turned at the creak of the porch step. His eyes were sharp now, not so hollow. He raised a hand, hesitant, then lowered it, not sure if he was allowed to wave. Samuel stepped down and motioned him closer. "You ever fed a hen?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "Well, come on then." Samuel scooped up a handful of feed from a burlap sack and poured it into the boy's palms. The grains spilled over his small fingers like gold dust. Caleb crouched low, scattered the feed, and watched the birds cluck and peck around his bare toes. For the first time Samuel heard him laugh, short and dry, but a laugh all the same. It sounded like sunlight breaking through a thundercloud, but back in town the storm was gathering. At Thompson's store, the men lingered longer than they needed to, scratching tobacco into pipes, swapping rumors like dirty coins. They said Holloway was a traitor. They said he'd gone soft. They said he'd be sorry when the rightful owner came knocking with a length of rope and a pack of dogs. When Martha Bell asked if anyone had spoken to the sheriff, old Silas Green, who prided himself on never missing a whisper, leaned in close enough for everyone to smell his sour breath. "Sheriff don't care. Long as Holloway keeps to his patch of dirt, nobody's gonna ride out there. But mark my words, one night a man'll wake to find that boy gone, and Holloway strung up with him." They laughed then, as men do when they don't know how to face their own cowardice. Outside, the wind kicked dust down the single muddy street, rattling the church sign that hadn't been painted in years. Back at the ranch, Samuel felt the change in the air. He spent more time cleaning the rifle, counting the shells in the wooden box under his bed. At night he sat on the porch with the oil lamp burning low, ears sharp for any hoofbeats that didn't belong. One afternoon, Caleb asked him why he sat there every night, staring into the dark. He spoke so softly Samuel had to lean forward to hear. The boy's voice still carried the broken edge of fear, but it was growing roots. Samuel didn't answer right away. He took his time lighting the cigar that had gone stale in his coat pocket. Finally, he said, "Folks out there, they don't like what they don't understand, and they sure don't like when a man does what's right instead of what's easy." Caleb looked puzzled. He was young enough to believe right was always safe. "Are they going to come for me?" Samuel tapped ash off the end of his cigar. "Maybe, but they'll have to come through me first." That night, a rock smashed through the kitchen window. Glass rained onto the cracked floorboards. Caleb jumped behind the table, heart pounding so hard Samuel could see it in his chest. Samuel stalked outside into the darkness, the rifle resting easy in his hands. He found nobody, only boot tracks in the mud, leading back toward town. The next day he hitched the mule and rode in for supplies. Heads turned as soon as he tied the reins to the hitching post outside Thompson's. A knot of men fell silent when he stepped onto the porch. They watched him like a stray dog tracking mud into a parlor. Inside the cluck, young Tom Weaver kept his eyes down while he measured flour and salt into Samuel's burlap sack. When Samuel set the coins on the counter, Tom cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway," he started, voice cracking like old paint, "folks are saying you ought to let that boy go." Samuel's jaw worked side to side before he spoke. "Folks say a lot of things, Tom. Never seen one yet worth listening to." Tom flinched as if the words were a slap. Samuel gathered the sack and left without another word. Outside he could feel their eyes following him all the way down the street, whispers snagging on his back like burrs in his coat. When he got home, Caleb was sweeping the barn, humming under his breath a tune Samuel didn't recognize. The boy looked up, startled, as Samuel stepped inside. "Did they hurt you?" Caleb asked. Samuel set the sack on a crate. "No, just words. Words don't bleed a man unless he lets them." Caleb's eyes softened, and for the first time he stepped forward and wrapped his thin arms around Samuel's waist. It was a clumsy, shy hug, over as soon as it began, but it knocked the air right out of Samuel's lungs. He stood there, staring at the boy's small back, wondering how a touch that light could weigh so much. That night, Samuel left the lamp burning in the window. He wanted them to see. He wanted every fool in town to know he was not afraid, or at least not so afraid he'd lock away what he'd chosen to protect. Out on the ridge above the corn rows, shadows moved. A match flared. Somewhere a man laughed low and mean. Samuel chambered around in the Winchester and sat down by the door. He didn't plan to sleep. If they came, they'd find the farmer ready. And inside, wrapped in a horse blanket, Caleb dreamed of chickens and open fields, the first night in his short life that he didn't dream of running. By the end of that week, word of Samuel Holloway's madness had spread farther than the dirt roads that hemmed in the town. A few passing wagons slowed near his gate, their drivers whispering behind cupped hands, eyes flicking to the barn as if they expected to see the boy chained up like some wild animal. They saw nothing, just a tired farmer splitting logs while a thin-armed child stacked kindling by his side. Inside the house, the broken window was patched with nailed planks. The wind slipped through the cracks, carrying the sour smell of the latrines behind Thompson's store, the place where the worst of the gossip was birthed. Samuel tried to ignore it, but at night, when the fire burned low, the words crawled under the door like snakes. One afternoon, Caleb found him by the water trough, scrubbing dirt from his work shirt. The boy's feet shuffled in the dust. He'd started to speak more now, voice shy, but steadier each day. "Mr. Holloway?" he asked, eyes fixed on his own toes. Samuel didn't look up from the trough. "Yeah, why don't they like me?" Samuel's hand froze in the cold water. He squeezed the fabric until it dripped. How do you tell a child the truth about men who hate what they fear? He dropped the shirt on the fence rail, wiped his hands on his trousers. "It ain't you they don't like, Caleb. It's what you remind them of." The boy's brow furrowed. "What's that? That they ain't half as good as they pretend to be?" Caleb thought on that a while. He nodded, though Samuel could see the weight of it pressing on those thin shoulders. Then the boy picked up a stick and poked at the mud by the trough. He drew lines, shapes Samuel couldn't name. Maybe he was just trying to untangle the knots in his mind. That same evening, a lone rider appeared on the road. The sun was falling fast, orange bleeding into purple behind the hills. Samuel leaned on the gate, rifle cradled, casual but loaded. The rider stopped a good distance away, close enough to shout, far enough to run if need be. He was dressed in a coat too fine for these parts. Dusty boots, city hat, but the grin was pure backwater cruelty. "Mr. Holloway," he called out. "Word is you're keeping something that don't belong to you." Samuel's thumb tapped the rifle's stock. "Ain't nobody owns a child." The rider laughed like a crow. "That's where you're wrong. There's a man upstate claims that boy's his property, says he's worth good money, enough to buy up this sad patch you call a ranch." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Tell him to come say that to my face." "Oh, he will. Maybe not tonight, but soon enough. And when he does, you best remember law's on his side." "The law?" Samuel spat into the dust. "I got my own law here." The rider's grin widened. He turned his horse with a sharp tug, spurring it into a trot back down the road. His voice floated back on the breeze. "Don't lose sleep, Holloway, not tonight anyhow." Samuel didn't move until the hoofbeats faded. Then he turned toward the barn. Inside, Caleb sat on the ground, sorting through a pile of old horseshoes, pretending he hadn't heard every word. But his eyes were wide, jaw clenched. Samuel ruffled his hair as he passed. "Don't worry, boy. Man who barks loudest usually bites least." But even as he said it, Samuel felt the lie sit bitter on his tongue. He knew what was coming. This place was too small to hide a fight for long. 2 days later, the pastor came calling. Reverend Maynard, a man whose white collar was as crisp as his sermons were stale. He arrived uninvited, tugging his hat off politely while his eyes darted over every corner of the yard. Caleb was nowhere in sight. Samuel had sent him to gather kindling deep in the trees. "Brother Holloway," Maynard began, voice oily with forced sympathy, "the congregation is concerned." "Is that so?" Samuel leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, rifle within reach. "It's unconventional what you're doing. This boy, he belongs to someone, and we must respect the order of things as the good book says." Samuel's eyes flashed like flint. "The good book says a man shouldn't leave a child to die. That's the part I'm minding." Maynard flinched at the edge in his tone. "But the town, you're stirring up resentment. Good men feel unsafe." Samuel pushed himself off the post, stepping in close enough for the preacher to smell the sweat and smoke clinging to his shirt. "You tell those good men if they want to feel safe, they ought to quit talking behind fences and come look me in the eye." The pastor shrank back, hat twisting in his hands. "Brother Holloway, you're courting trouble. I'd hate to see you lose this land over—" Samuel cut him off, voice quiet, but sharp as a drawn knife. "Then don't stand on my porch wagging your tongue like a dog's tail. Go on home." Maynard left without blessing the house. He climbed back into his buggy, lips moving in silent prayer, though whether for Samuel's soul or for his own skin, the farmer couldn't say. That night Caleb found Samuel sitting under the oak where his wife lay buried. The boy sat beside him without a word. For a long while, they just listened to the cicadas hum. Then Caleb spoke, his voice as thin as the wind through the branches. "You think they'll come tonight?" Samuel looked at him, really looked. The boy was no longer a shadow behind the cornrows. He was flesh, bone, defiance. "Maybe," Samuel said, "but if they do, they won't find you alone." Caleb nodded. He pressed his back against Samuel's side, their shoulders touching like two fence posts bracing against a storm. And there, under the hush of the old oak, they sat, lines drawn in dust, a man and a boy daring the world to cross them. The nights turned heavy with threat. Clouds rolled over the hills like bruised fists, smothering the moon in darkness so thick Samuel could hardly see the old fence posts at the edge of his pasture. Every creak of the barn door, every distant howl of a coyote made him tighten his grip on the Winchester. Caleb sensed it too. He no longer asked if trouble was coming. He just stayed close, helping where he could. In the mornings he gathered eggs, though the hens pecked his ankles raw. By afternoon, he'd sit by Samuel's side, mending harness straps with clumsy fingers that steadied more each day. One morning, Samuel found the boy cleaning the old revolver that hadn't been fired since his wife died. The sight made Samuel's chest twist, not with anger, but a kind of sorrow so deep he had to look away. "You ever use one of those?" Samuel asked, voice dry as the dust that coated the yard. Caleb shook his head. "No, sir. Just thought I should know how." Samuel nodded once. No lecture, no talk of what was right or wrong. Out here, a man didn't always get to choose what a boy ought to know. By sundown that day, word came that the man claiming Caleb, a trader named Burke, had ridden into town with 3 hired men and a slip of paper that said the boy was property. The paper was waved around the saloon like a flag of righteousness. Some said Burke planned to make an example of Holloway. Others said he'd just as soon burn the barn to the ground and drag the boy out like a dog on a chain. Samuel heard this from Tom Weaver, who rode out at dusk, hat twisting in his hands. "They're at the saloon now, drinking up courage. They mean to come tonight, Samuel." Samuel spat into the dust. "Then let 'em." Tom shifted from foot to foot. "You shouldn't stand alone in this." "Ain't no man standing with me either, is there?" Samuel asked. Tom dropped his gaze. "It's not that we don't care. It's exactly that. Get on home, Tom." When Tom's horse vanished into the dark, Samuel turned to find Caleb standing by the porch steps, clutching an oil lantern so tight his knuckles were white. "They're coming." Samuel took the lantern from him, set it on the top step. "They might. You ready?" Caleb nodded. It was the kind of nod that doesn't come from courage, but from knowing there's no other road to walk. They moved the boy's cot deeper into the barn, wedged between bales of hay where no flame could reach if things turned to fire. Samuel checked every latch, every window shutter, then sat on the porch with the lantern burning low beside his boots. He kept the rifle across his knees. Inside the barn, Caleb pressed his ear to the wall, listening for hoofbeats. It wasn't long before they came. A dull glow crept over the ridge. 4 riders, their lanterns bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps. Samuel could hear the men laughing, half drunk, half mean, eager for something to break. The first to dismount was Burke himself. He was big-bellied, with a bristly mustache and the look of a man who liked to watch other men bleed, so he didn't have to get his own hands dirty. "Evening, Holloway," Burke called out, voice slick as grease. "You got something of mine." Samuel stayed seated, one hand resting loose on the stock of the Winchester. "Don't see your brand on him." Burke spat into the dirt, grin wide and sour. "You got a piece of paper says otherwise." "A piece of paper don't change a boy into livestock." One of the hired men shifted his rifle nervously. "We can do this easy, old man. Hand him over. We'll be gone before dawn." Samuel's eyes flicked to the barn door just once. "That boy's free." "Always was." Burke's grin died. He stepped closer, boots crunching in the dry grass. "This ain't a sermon, Holloway. You give him to me now, or I take your land too. Nobody here's gonna stop me. You know that." Samuel rose slow, the rifle still at his side. He looked each man in the eye. "You think I care about this dirt? You burn it all if you want, but you ain't taking that boy." Burke gave a low chuckle. He turned to his men. "He wants to play preacher. Fine. Burn the barn. Smoke the little bastard out." One man struck a match, and the tiny flare lit up the hatred in Burke's eyes. Samuel raised the Winchester before the match touched the kindling. "I fire 1 shot, Burke. Just 1. And it won't miss." The men froze. The match hissed out in the night wind. Burke's smile slipped, not because he feared Samuel, but because he saw it now. The old man didn't bluff. Holloway would shoot, and then he'd keep shooting till someone put him in the ground. The standoff dragged under the cold stars. Caleb could see their shadows through the cracks in the barn wall, the outlines of men who'd come for his life, stopped by one who'd claimed it was worth something. Burke spat again, this time at Samuel's boots. "This ain't over, Holloway." Samuel didn't lower the rifle. "Ain't over till you quit coming. Now go on, sun'll be up soon." One by one, the men mounted up, cursing under their breath. Burke lingered longest, eyes full of rot. Then he turned his horse. The lanterns bobbed away, and the darkness swallowed them whole. When the hoofbeats were gone, Samuel sank onto the porch steps. His hands shook as he set the rifle down, breath ragged as a torn flag. Inside the barn, Caleb crept out from behind the hay bales, feet bare on the cold floorboards. He stepped into the yard, the moon breaking through at last, silvering the sweat on Samuel's brow. The boy didn't say a word. He just sat beside the old man, leaned his small shoulder against Samuel's arm. In that quiet, with lantern light flickering weak against the dawn, the line between farmer and fugitive, master and slave, grown man and lost child, all of it fell away like dust in the wind. For 2 days after Burke and his men rode off, the farm held its breath. The wind moved through the cracked barn boards like a sigh that never settled. Samuel worked slower than before, the old rifle never far from reach. Caleb stayed close, no longer asking questions, just watching, learning how Samuel tied knots, loaded shells, or fixed a fence with steady hands. Word came on the 3rd morning. Burke had gone to the county judge, claiming Caleb as property. He was gathering more men to ride back, louder, meaner, desperate for coin. Samuel knew they couldn't wait on the porch forever. That afternoon, he hitched the mule to the old wagon. Caleb climbed into the back, hidden under a mildewed tarp. They rode slow down the dirt road, the sun dipping behind the scrub oaks. At a bend where the road forked, Samuel pulled the mule to a halt. They waited in the hush, the old Winchester laid across Samuel's knees. Near dusk the men came, 6 riders, lanterns bobbing, voices loud with liquor and false courage. Burke rode at the front, paper in hand like it could wipe the dust off his boots. He pulled his horse short when he saw the wagon blocking the way. "Step aside, Holloway," Burke barked. "We're taking what's ours." Samuel didn't move. "You want him? You deal with me here." Burke's grin turned cold. "Law's on my side now." "Law's what a man makes it," Samuel shot back. One hired gun struck a match to torch the barn when they got through. But before flame met kindling, hoofbeats rose from the trees. Steady, organized, not drunk or mean. Out of the dusk rode a line of Union soldiers, blue coats dusty, sabers strapped to saddles. A captain at their head raised a hand, his voice calm but final. "That boy's free. "The farmer here says so. So does the law." Burke's men faltered. Nobody wanted a fight that brought soldiers and real jail time. Burke spat into the dirt, eyes poison. "This ain't over," Samuel only shrugged. "It is for him." As Burke and his men turned back, the soldiers rode up. Caleb peered from the wagon, eyes wide at the line of blue uniforms. The captain offered his hand. The boy climbed down slow, his thin fingers gripping the man's glove. When the captain turned to Samuel, he gave him a crisp salute. One by one, the soldiers tipped their hats to the old farmer who had stood alone when no one else would. By the bend in that dusty road, under a fading sky, Samuel Holloway stood with a boy who was no longer anyone's property, a boy who was, at last, just free. When the soldiers rode out at dawn, the dust of their hoofbeats lingered on the road long after they were gone. Samuel stood there beside the wagon, watching until the last blue coat vanished beyond the low hills. Beside him, Caleb squinted into the morning light, small hands gripping the wooden gate like he was afraid to let go. Back at the farm, the chores didn't stop. The world didn't pause just because they'd faced down a mob and sent them packing. Samuel still had hogs to feed, fences to mend, and a barn door that needed a new latch. Caleb trailed behind him all morning, sweeping the yard with a broom twice his height, never once asking if Burke would come back. The gossip in town shriveled fast. Men who'd spit at Samuel's name now avoided it altogether. At Thompson's store, Martha Bell tried to spin her tale softer, saying she'd always known Holloway had a good heart under all that mule-headedness. Samuel didn't care. He went into town only when the bins were empty, tipping his hat to the sheriff, who suddenly found reason to nod back. One evening, Samuel found Caleb sitting on the porch steps, a battered book balanced on his knees, something Tom Weaver's wife had slipped him, a primer with smudged pages and letters, big enough for a boy's eyes to follow. Caleb traced each word with his finger, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth as he sounded out the lines. When he caught Samuel watching, he grinned shy, but didn't close the book. They didn't talk much about what came next. Samuel knew he couldn't keep the boy hidden away forever. The world would be larger than this patch of stubborn dirt. But for now, this land was enough. They rose each dawn together, milked the goats, fixed what broke, and left the gate open for whatever good might wander in. Sometimes at dusk, Caleb would sit under the old oak where Samuel's wife lay buried. He'd talk to the headstone in his soft, halting way, telling her about the hens that pecked his boots, or how he'd learned to mend a fence without cutting his palms raw. Samuel watched from the yard, the sight of it like a balm he didn't know he'd been waiting for. And when the wind picked up through the corn rows, the same rows where Caleb had first hidden like a hunted rabbit, Samuel would lean on his fence post, pipe cold between his teeth, and think maybe the land had given him something back after all these years. Not wealth, not glory, just a boy who called this place home. No one came for Caleb again. The road stayed quiet, but the gate never stayed closed. Sometimes a passing wagon would stop for water. The driver would tip his hat, speak the farmer's name with a note of respect that hadn't been there before. And when they'd ride on, they'd glance back at the porch, where a thin-armed boy read his letters aloud, voice clear and growing stronger each day. In the hush of that forgotten stretch of prairie, people said the farm changed. They said Holloway softened. Some said the boy saved him, others that Holloway saved the boy. But if you asked Samuel, he'd just grunt and say he did what any man ought to do when faced with a choice: open the gate. And so the farm stood, rough and weathered, a patch of honest dirt under a sky that seemed a little wider than before. Proof that courage, once given room to breathe, can echo long after the last wagon wheel fades into the dust.